on Gill's exposition of the entire Bible. Revelation chapter 3, verse 1. And unto the angel of the church in Sardis write, of the city of Sardis, see my note, Revelations 1:11. When and by whom this church was founded, and who was the present angel or pastor of it, is not now to be certainly known. However, here was a church in the 2nd century, of which Melito, that's Melito, was then pastor, and he is thought by some to be the angel here intended. This man wrote upon the book of the Revelation an apology for the Christians sent to the emperor. Do you know this? Verse. That's Antoninus Verus, in whose times he lived. And in the 3rd century, a church remained in this place, and also in the 4th, as appears from the Council of Nice, which makes mention of it, and likewise in the 5th, as is evident from the Acts of the Synod at, in which age it was the Metropolitan Church of the Lydians, Lydians. And in the 6th century, there was a bishop of this church in the 5th Synod at Constantinople. And in the 7th century, Marinus, that's Marinus, Bishop of Sardis, assisted at the 6th Synod in the same place. And in the 8th century, Euthymius, Bishop of it, was present in the Nisan Synod. And even in the 9th century, mention is made of an Archbishop of Sardis. But now there are but very few Christians to be found here, and who have not a place to worship in, nor any to minister to them. This church represents the state of the church from the time of the Reformation by Luther and others until the more glorious state of the church appears, or until the spiritual reign of Christ in the Philadelphian period under the Sardian church state we now are. This was published in 1747. That this church is an emblem of the Reformed churches from popery is evident not only from its following the Tartarians, Thyatirian state, which expresses the darkness of popery, the popes, and the depths of Satan in it, but from its being clear of Balaam and those that held his doctrine, and from the Nicolaitans and their tenets, and from Jezebel and those that committed adultery with her, things which the two former churches are charged with, but from these present church reformed. This city of Sardis was once a very flourishing and opulent city. It was the metropolis of Lydia and the royal seat of the rich king Croesus, Croesus, though now a very poor and mean village. It may denote the magnificence and splendor of this church state, at least in name and figure. It has appeared in the world, though now in a very low and mean condition, and may be worse before the spiritual reign of Christ begins in the next period. There may be some allusion in the name of this church to the precious stone Sardia, Sarda, which Pliny says was found about Sardis and had its name from hence. The same was the Sardian stone, Revelation 4, verse 2. This stone, naturalist says, drives away fear, gives boldness, trueness, and sharpness of wit, and frees from witchcraft and sorceries, which may be expressive of the boldness and courage of the first reformers, of the cheerfulness, joy, and pleasure which appeared in their countenances, and which they spread in others by preaching the doctrines of the gospel, and of those excellent gifts and talents, both of nature, learning, and grace, by which they were lifted for their service, and of there being a means of delivering men from the witchcrafts of Jezebel and the sorceries of the whoredom of Rome. And perhaps some allusion may be in this name, as is thought by Cocceius, to the Hebrew word dyrv, Sarid, which signifies a remnant. Since in this church state, there is a remnant according to the action of grace. A few names: garments were undefiled, or to the word Stred, which signifies a carpenter's rule or line, since the first reformers were endeavoring to bring every doctrine and practice to the rule and line of God's Word. These things saith he that hath the 7 spirits of God, the fullness and perfection of the gifts and graces of the Spirit of God, as in Revelations 1:4, which Christ as mediator has without measure and are at his disposal, and which he, having received for men, gives unto them, and at the time of the Reformation bestowed them on many eminent servants of his in a very plenteous manner, for which reason he assumes this character in writing to his church. And to the 7 stars, the ministers of the gospel. So you may note Revelation 1:16 and Revelation 2:1. These were filled with Christ at this time with evangelistical light and knowledge, and were set and held forth by him as lights in the world, and were instruments in his hand for great good, and were wonderfully held, kept, and preserved by him, notwithstanding the greatness of their work, their weaknesses in themselves, and the power, rage, and fury of the anti-Christian party. Luther is a remarkable instance of this. Christ, making use of the same title here as in the epistle to the church at Ephesus, which represents the apostolic church, may show that this church state, bore some degree of likeness to that, and that it was a sort of renewing of it. Their works, good works chiefly, the nature and perfection of them, and also bad works, that thou hast a name, that thou livest. The Reformed churches have had a name for spiritual living, by faith on Christ's righteousness only for justification. That article, being the great article of the Reformation, there was in them an appearance of liveliness by the zeal for gospel doctrine and worship, and a form of living according to godliness. They were esteemed, were celebrated, and famous for these things, especially for living by faith on Christ's righteousness, and art dead, but art dead. For the most part, or greater part of the members of these churches are dead in trespasses and sins, and as for the rest, they are very dead and lifeless in these frames, in the exercise of grace, in the discharge of duties, and under great spiritual declension and decays, just as it were ready to die, and but few really alive in a spiritual sense, and especially lively, or in a lively exercise of grace, and fever discharge of duty. Yea, dead as to those things in which they had a name to live, and this seems to be our case now, who, it is to be hoped, are at or towards the close of this period. End of John Gill, Revelation chapter 3, verse 1.